Welcome back to the Doctrine Deep Dive. We are starting what is arguably one of the most critical discussions in international security today.
We really are.
The paradox of nuclear proliferation. It's this fundamental tension that sits right at the heart of our study of globalization. It impacts international organizations, security alliances, and it fundamentally alters the character of war itself.
It absolutely does.
And it forces us to ask this really uncomfortable question. Do the world's most destructive weapons actually make us safer, or are they pushing us closer to the brink?
Indeed. We're looking at how the presence of these weapons, or even just the possibility of them, transformed how states behave, how they form alliances, and really their entire risk calculation in a world that's more and more interconnected.
Right.
So our focus today is really defining that core theoretical debate. It's the nuclear optimists versus the nuclear pessimists. Do these weapons create stability through absolute deterrence? Or do they basically guarantee failure because of organizational and, just human flaws? And this distinction, it's not just academic.
No, not at all.
It dictates global policy on huge issues like arms control and intervention.
That's the mission. We're trying to move beyond the simple headlines to really dissect the complex theoretical and organizational challenges that these weapons introduce into the global system.
And we have a phenomenal stack of sources to guide us today.
We do. They truly define the fault lines of this entire field.
Our foundation really comes from two seminal works that lay out these opposing views. First, you have Kenneth Waltz's powerful realist argument in Nuclear Myths and Political Realities.
The case for nuclear stability.
That's the one. And then you have Scott Sagan's critical counterargument, which is rooted in organizational theory and laid out in The Perils of Proliferation in South Asia.
And then we're going to take those big theories and apply them directly to contemporary challenges. We'll be diving into the recent, very high-stakes debate on the Iranian nuclear program.
Right, contrasting two very different takes.
We'll look at Ray Takeyh's argument in The Bomb Will Backfire on Iran, and then contrast that with the very pointed rebuttal from Eric Brewer, a nuclear Iran is not inevitable.
So our goal is to synthesize these competing theories. We're going to use South Asia as a crucial real-world case study to see exactly how these organizational flaws can compromise security.
And then see how it all plays out today.
And then analyze how these theoretical models are shaping the policy discussions about Iran right now. We are really looking for those specific nuggets of knowledge that move you from just knowing about proliferation to truly understanding the core risks.
Let's get to it.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this core theoretical split. This is, like you said, the intellectual fault line that divides nuclear scholars. On one side, you have the proliferation optimists.
And on the other, the proliferation pessimists.
Let's start with the optimists.
That's right. The optimists, famously represented here by Kenneth Waltz, they argue from a classical realist perspective. Their argument is it's structural.
What do you mean by structural?
I mean, it's about the system itself, not the individual leaders or countries. The idea is that states will always seek measures to preserve their own security, and nuclear weapons are simply the most effective, the most efficient means of doing that.
And Waltz doesn't pull any punches on this. He calls them a tremendous force for peace.
He really does. A force for peace that affords security at a reasonable cost. Well, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And this optimism, it rests almost entirely on what we call the logic of deterrence.
Almost entirely. The idea is because of the sheer, just unimaginable damage of a nuclear war, any state, and this is key, any state, regardless of its ideology, its leadership, whatever.
It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or a dictatorship.
It doesn't matter. They will be deterred from starting any war that might escalate to a nuclear confrontation. The risk to the regime's own survival is just too absolute to even consider.
So it's based on pure, universal rationality.
Exactly. The catastrophic promise of nuclear war means that even if one state gets a temporary conventional advantage or even a nuclear one, it will never initiate a major war at the center of international politics, as long as the opponent has a survivable force.
The second strike capability.
The second strike capability, right. The ability to retaliate. As long as that exists, deterrence holds. And Waltz really sees this as an iron law of international relations.
Okay, so that's the clean, rational optimist view. But this is where the pessimists, led here by Scott Sagan, they step in with a really powerful critique.
A very powerful one.
They argue that relying just on rational deterrence theory is dangerously simplistic. It assumes leaders and their organizations are working with perfect information, flawless communication.
And unwavering rationality, which,
Yeah.
I mean, once you look at actual history, you know that's just not true.
It's just not how humans or bureaucracies work.
Sagan argues that deterrence could fail through a number of inherent organizational problems. He talks about organizational bias, organizational errors, and these entrenched organizational routines.
So what he's really saying is that to accurately predict if a new nuclear state will be stable, we have to apply organization theory. We have to look at the actual people, the structures, the processes that manage the weapons.
Not just abstract models of rational choice.
Exactly. It shifts the focus dramatically. Yeah, it moves the conversation from this idea of a perfect state operating in a vacuum
To the imperfect, error-prone bureaucracy run by actual human beings. And the evidence, Sagan contends, it really supports the pessimist view, because these organizational imperfections will, over time, just invariably lead to instability.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because Waltz's arguments are so clean, almost mathematically elegant.
They are. His argument, as he lays it out in Nuclear Myths and Political Realities, it truly emphasizes what he calls the absolute quality of nuclear weapons.
The absolute quality.
And he says this absolute quality is what fundamentally stabilizes international relations in a way that conventional weapons never, ever could.
Why not? What's the difference?
Because conventional weapons always leave room for hope. Hope of victory.
Okay, tell us more about what he means by this absolute quality. How does it specifically change state behavior beyond just, making the risks higher?
Well, for Waltz, nuclear weapons purify deterrent strategies. By this, he means they sort of strip away all the other elements.
Like what?
Like defense, warfighting, strategic maneuver, all the things that complicate conventional conflicts. In a nuclear world, you don't need a massive conventional army or some complex air defense network to guarantee your survival.
I just need to make sure a few of your missiles get through.
You only need to ensure that a small number of warheads reach their targets in a retaliatory strike. That's it.
So conventional defense becomes almost irrelevant, which, wow, that simplifies everything down to raw offense and assured retaliation.
It does.
And this must have a huge impact on military spending. If you don't need to win a war, you just need to survive and hit back. That changes the entire calculation.
Absolutely. Waltz stresses that the invulnerability of a sufficient number of warheads, that ability to launch a second strike, is easy to achieve.
Easy. That seems like a big claim.
He thinks so. And that their delivery is impossible to thwart. This inherent invulnerability, even if you're a smaller country facing a larger foe, means the entire power structure is deeply stable. He contrasts this very sharply.
Yeah, so?
He says the catastrophe promised by nuclear war contrasts sharply with the difficulty of predicting outcomes in conventional conflicts. In a conventional war, generals always retain hope of some kind of breakthrough victory. With nuclear weapons, that hope is gone.
And because that catastrophe is guaranteed, Waltz then argues that second strike forces make comparing states, quote, pointless.
Precisely. It is pointless to compare the characteristics or to scrutinize the leaders of two nuclear countries if both of them have survivable second strike forces.
Now that is the crucial leap of faith for the optimists.
It is. They argue that even a nuclear country that enjoys numerical superiority, say it has more warheads, is still reluctant to use them.
Why?
Because no one can promise the full success of a disarming first strike. If even a handful of the opponent's warheads survive and are launched in retaliation, the aggressor suffers total, absolute ruin.
Wait, but isn't that incredibly difficult to accept? I mean, when we look at the instability of political systems in places like Pakistan, or the often inflammatory rhetoric we hear from Tehran, doesn't the leader always matter when escalation is on the table?
That is the central challenge that the pessimists raise. But Waltz, he just rejects it.
He just brushes it aside.
From his structural realist viewpoint, the political system, whether it's a democracy, an autocracy, stable, unstable, it's all secondary to the overwhelming, destructive reality of the weapons themselves.
The logic is that if you're the leader, your number one goal is regime survival.
Right. And initiating a nuclear war guarantees regime non-survival. It's suicide. Therefore, he concludes, the probability of major war among states that have nuclear weapons approaches zero. It's a very elegant, I'll grant you, but also very rigid theoretical position.
It is, and it offers a strange kind of reassurance. But Waltz does offer a crucial caveat, which I think is often forgotten. about the scope of deterrence.
Yes, this is very important. He notes that nuclear deterrence only works against major aggression at the center.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning core national interests, your border security, existential threats to your nation. It does not work against minor aggression at the periphery.
So you can still have smaller fights.
You can still have lower-level conflicts, things like skirmishes across a border or proxy wars, because both sides know they won't escalate to the existential nuclear level. This is the whole basis of the stability-instability paradox, which we are definitely going to see play out in South Asia.
And Waltz believes this inherent stability would only change if someone could develop a foolproof defense system.
Yes. He acknowledges that strategic defenses, ones capable of intercepting all incoming warheads, would radically change these propositions. It would effectively undo the concept of the assured second strike.
But he doesn't think it's possible.
He dismisses the possibility. He states that the deployment of a perfect defense against nuclear weapons is inconceivable. So for Waltz, the stability that nuclear deterrence provides is a fundamental reality we just have to accept.
Okay, so we have Waltz arguing that nuclear weapons are a simple, clean force for peace, all based on these rational state calculations. Now, we switch gears and listen to Sagan, who essentially comes in and says, Waltz, you've forgotten the humans.
And the messy bureaucracies who actually build, store, and manage these systems. He says the whole theory of stability relies on organizational perfection, which is just impossible.
So Sagan argues that Waltz's 3 requirements for stable nuclear deterrence are critical, but that they're incredibly difficult to meet in the real world.
Especially for newly proliferating states. They just don't have the decades of trial and error that the United States and the Soviet Union went through during the Cold War.
And just to remind everyone, those 3 requirements are, first, preventing war when one side has a temporary advantage.
Second, developing those survivable second-strike capabilities we've been talking about.
And third, the avoidance of accidental nuclear war. Sagan believes organizational flaws make achieving all 3 of those almost impossible.
That is the crux of his argument in The Perils of Proliferation in South Asia. Let's look at the first problem, which is arguably the most dangerous one, the preventive war bias.
Okay.
Sagan argues that military organizations, by their very nature, have a deep-seated bias in favor of launching a preventive war.
Why? Why would military officers be more biased towards striking first than the civilian political leaders who, according to Waltz, are driven by pure rationality?
He gives 3 interconnected organizational reasons. First, because of self-selection in the professional training environment, military officers often operate under this fatalistic belief that war with a particular adversary is inevitable in the long run.
So if you think war is going to happen anyway,
then it makes perfect organizational sense to strike the adversary now when their capacity is weaker, before they can strengthen their own retaliatory forces.
So they see a temporary advantage or a closing window of opportunity, and they feel compelled to act before that window closes. They see striking first as the path to minimizing casualties and maximizing victory in a fight they believe has to happen anyway.
Precisely. The second reason is the bias toward offensive doctrines.
Meaning they'd rather be on the attack than on defense?
Always. Offensive operations, developing complex war plans, executing them, achieving strategic advantage. They offer glory, promotion opportunities, and they allow for faster implementation than defense.
And defense seems passive.
Exactly. Defensive plans can seem limiting and passive to a professional military culture. Offensive planning is simply more prestigious within the military bureaucracy.
And the third organizational bias, that deals with where the military focuses its attention compared to the civilian government.
That's right. Military officers are just less likely than civilian leaders to focus on all the domestic and international disincentives against using force. Their focus is victory, mission success, the logistics of the fight.
They're not thinking about the political fallout.
They're less attuned to political considerations like maintaining international alliances or handling post-war reconstruction costs or navigating all the complex political constraints on initiating force. The civilian leader worries about the global reaction. The general worries about winning the battle.
That distinction is so crucial. It suggests that even if the civilian leader has that rational desire to hold back, the organizational apparatus below them is constantly providing plans, intelligence, and internal pressure that all favors striking first.
And we see historical examples of this even in the supposedly stable Cold War. Sagan references discussions within the U.S. military right after the Soviet atomic bomb test in 1949.
What happened?
There were genuine high-level internal discussions advocating for preventive strikes against the Soviet Union. For
Yeah.
instance, you had Major General Orville Anderson, who was the commandant of the Air University in 1950, openly discussing launching a preventive attack against the Soviets. He said he believed it would save civilization.
That is chilling, that the organizational preference for offense over patience was present even in mature nuclear states like the United States. It really makes you wonder what kind of unknown conversations are happening right now in Islamabad or Tehran.
And while President Eisenhower ultimately rejected those proposals in 1954, the very fact that senior military figures were championing that strategy just illustrates this powerful organizational bias that Sagan describes.
Okay, so that leads us directly to the second problem he identifies, the problem of survivability.
Right. Waltz claims second strike forces are easy to achieve, but Sagan suggests that organizational routines often undermine this.
Survivability depends on keeping your launch sites secret, safe, mobile. But these routines, the day-to-day practices you need to manage a nuclear program, they tend to produce signatures.
Signatures that can give away those secret locations to enemy intelligence.
Yeah, it's like,
How does that happen?
well, if you're running a missile program, you have organizational necessities, things like routine maintenance, transportation schedules, specialized equipment needs, or even just high-frequency secure communications coming from a particular location. All these things can create predictable patterns.
Patterns that an enemy can spot.
Even unintentional actions can reveal critical vulnerabilities to the enemy's intelligence agencies.
And we have evidence of this happening in our case study region.
We do,
Yep.
specifically in South Asia. Evidence suggests that the Pakistani military, in its haste and probably with limited resources, deployed its missile forces in ways that produced these very intelligent signatures, revealing their locations. And if Indian intelligence can intercept messages or detect these patterns and pinpoint the locations of supposedly survivable nuclear weapons,
Then those arsenals become vulnerable. They're no longer survivable.
and this feeds directly into the most dangerous risk in a crisis, which is the use it or lose it problem.
Absolutely. If one side, say Pakistan, perceives that their small, vulnerable arsenal is under immediate threat from the opponent's conventional war plans. For example, if a rapid Indian ground offensive threatens the survivability of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, that dramatically increases the organizational pressure on military commanders to use the weapons preemptively.
Before they're destroyed on the ground.
Right. This is a potential pathway to deterrence failure that Waltz's theory of pure rationality just ignores, because the organization is reacting to a perceived vulnerability, not through some calm, rational deliberation.
Finally, let's address the third problem, the risks of accidental nuclear war. This brings us back to complexity and control, and this is where Sagan introduces some specific language from organizational theory.
He says that serious accidents are likely over time in systems that are highly complex and tightly coupled. We should probably define those terms.
Yes, please.
A system is complex when it has many interacting components, and those interactions are difficult to predict and monitor. The U.S. and Soviet systems were incredibly complex. They involved numerous layers of command, many different weapon types, and huge geographical dispersal.
And tightly coupled.
A system is tightly coupled when there's very little time for operators to intervene between an error occurring and a catastrophe happening.
There's no slack in the system.
Correct. Now, the deterrence system in South Asia is actually less complex than the U.S.-Soviet system. They have smaller arsenals, fewer organizational layers. But Sagan argues it is more tightly coupled because of extreme geographical proximity. They share a border. Missile flight times are incredibly short.
We're talking minutes.
In some cases, just minutes.
So even though their systems are simpler, that lack of warning time makes a risk of a catastrophic accident much higher.
Precisely. If a launch occurs, the time for high-level decision-making is compressed to minutes. The danger that one technical error, one human mistake, or one false alarm could cascade into a catastrophic event is very, very high.
Wow.
And what's more, there's serious concern over whether India and Pakistan can even maintain centralized control over nuclear use decisions given that compressed timeline.
And we shouldn't overlook the basic organizational safety measures that are just missing.
That's right. Sagan points out that neither government has instituted crucial safety measures that have historically been considered basic necessities in mature nuclear powers.
Like what?
Things like mandatory psychological screening tests or robust mental health monitoring programs for the personnel who are involved in nuclear custody and deployment. This is a profound organizational lapse that greatly exacerbates the risk of accidental use or misuse, and it really supports Sagan's fundamental pessimism.
This discussion of organizational vulnerabilities brings us directly to the real-world application. We have to use the historical crises involving India and Pakistan to ground Sagan's arguments. These two countries tested their weapons in 1998, and the security environment changed overnight. Theory became volatile reality.
And the nuclear arsenals in South Asia are, as the sources say, much smaller and less sophisticated than the Cold War arsenals. This inherently makes them more vulnerable to a counterforce attack, which just amplifies all those survivability problems Sagan talked about.
We also see critical differences in their civil-military relations, which profoundly impacts control and that organizational bias.
That's a huge factor.
Let's review the command structures. India has a long tradition of strong civilian control over the military. Historically, the military played very little direct role in nuclear policy decisions, testing, or design.
Which suggests greater civilian oversight, and that could potentially reduce the likelihood of that military organizational bias running rampant.
Pakistan, however,
Is a very different story. The military has complete control of the nuclear arsenal. Civilian leaders in Islamabad have only marginal influence, if any.
and that matters profoundly when we look at the organizational biases favoring offensive action.
It does, because the key decision makers are already primed to view conflict as inevitable and to favor preemption.
Okay, so let's start with the brass tacks crisis of 1986-1987. This was a massive Indian military exercise. I mean, 250,000 troops, mechanized divisions, right near the Pakistani border in Rajasthan. How did a conventional exercise escalate into a crisis with nuclear undertones?
Well, Pakistan perceived this massive, highly mobile, large-scale exercise as either an inadvertently provocative action or, even more dangerously, a deliberate attempt to implement a pre-existing war plan.
They thought it was a trick.
They did. The scale of the movement bringing mechanized armor right up to the border-led Pakistani leaders, particularly the military, to believe that the exercise was cover for a larger Indian preventive military response.
A response aimed at what?
Aimed at removing their nuclear infrastructure before it could become fully secure.
So this is that organizational bias toward preventive war in action. They interpreted a military exercise as a veiled attack.
Exactly. The crisis escalated incredibly quickly, with both sides mobilizing. Pakistani leaders alerted their forces, and the crisis was only resolved after direct, high-level diplomatic intervention.
It took prime ministers talking on the phone.
A specific emergency telephone conversation between the prime ministers and then subsequent diplomatic engagement. It underscores that it took the highest level of political intervention to override the organizational inertia that was pushing towards escalation.
And the traditional explanation for this was always that it was just an accidental crisis caused by a Pakistani misinterpretation, but the organizational perspective unpacks this further.
It suggests that Indian military leaders might have themselves been operating under their own organizational biases. That finding is critical. Evidence suggests that the chief of the army staff for India, at the time of brass tacks, might have used the exercise to develop a usable nuclear arsenal and then deliberately designed brass tacks to be a provocative military response.
So he was trying to provoke a war?
Potentially. The hope may have been to implement existing contingency plans to go on the offensive. A general, who was the commander-in-chief of the Western Army during brass tacks, later claimed the exercise was not a military necessity. He called it a plan to build up a situation for a fourth war with Pakistan.
That is a stark illustration of the potential for military leaders to engage in provocative behavior that civilian leaders might not even be fully aware of.
Or supported? Yes.
Then, just over a decade later, we had the Kargil conflict in 1999, a fight along the line of control, and here the organizational biases were even more front and center.
The Pakistani military planned the Kargil operation unilaterally. It was fueled by an organizational assumption that the nuclear backdrop provided a shield.
The stability-instability paradox.
The core concept of it. They believed the nuclear threat would deter India from escalating the conflict across the international border, which would thereby grant them the freedom to conduct aggressive, conventional actions in that contested territory.
So this is where Waltz's caveat that deterrence works at the center but not the periphery clashes violently with Sagan's organizational flaws.
Yes. The Pakistani military believed the nuclear bomb provided conventional freedom of action.
And that assumption was fundamentally flawed.
And dangerously destabilizing. The conflict rapidly exposed the dangers of proliferation when it's coupled with this kind of organizational risk-taking. Pakistani leaders alerted their nuclear forces during the conflict.
And what was India's response?
Crucially, Indian leaders were seriously considering escalating the conflict. They were talking about potentially crossing the international border or even attacking known Pakistani nuclear facilities.
Which would have been the ultimate preventive strike scenario that the Pakistani military feared all along.
The very one.
So the key organizational takeaway from both brass tacks and Kargil is that these problems that Sagan identified, the biases favoring preventative and offensive action, compounded by the low survivability of these small arsenals, they aren't just theoretical.
They are not theoretical constructs. They are real, they're persistent, and they repeatedly push South Asia to the brink of nuclear use. The evidence really suggests that even in a nuclear environment, organizational problems compromise survivability, and they increase the dangers of preventive and accidental war. It's a strong empirical foundation for the pessimist viewpoint.
So now we pivot from the organizational realities of South Asia to a contemporary global flashpoint, the Iranian nuclear program. This is a classic example of this whole debate optimist versus pessimist playing out in real time among foreign policy experts.
And directly informing high-stakes international policy. You're looking at the clash between Ray Takeyh and Eric Brewer. And Takeyh represents a unique, almost counterintuitive perspective.
He argues that a nuclear Iran is inevitable.
But, paradoxically, that the bomb will ultimately backfire on the regime itself.
Okay, let's unpack that. Takeyh starts with the premise that a negotiated solution is impossible.
Right. He says given Iran's deep suspicion of the United States, its historical memory of intervention, its regional ambitions, he believes their march toward the bomb is inevitable.
And he also thinks that neither the U.S. nor Israel is likely to use overt military force to eliminate the program.
The risk of a regional war is just too high. So, he says we have to prepare for a nuclear-armed Iran.
And his prediction is fascinating. It sort of echoes some of Waltz's structural realism, but with a political twist.
It does. He claims the bomb will backfire because after decades of sacrifice, it is nearly impossible to translate an atomic capability into strategic advantage. He argues Iran has spent all this time and money pursuing the bomb, suffering sanctions and isolation, only to find that it yields no measurable change in their power or security.
Which would make the entire effort economically and strategically disastrous. So what's his policy recommendation? He says we should pivot immediately from trying to prevent the bomb to actively challenging the regime once they have it.
It's a very aggressive stance. Takeyh recommends a much-needed reset of U.S. policy. This includes things like aggressively deploying nuclear-armed vessels to the Persian Gulf, and even placing atomic tip missiles controlled by U.S. forces in allied Gulf states.
So essentially mashing the Iranian capability with a forward-deployed American response.
Right. And the anticipated blowback he predicts is specific and targeted. First, he says it will trigger harsh, multilateral sanctions aimed at completely isolating Tehran.
Stripping them of their ability to use the international banking system.
Reducing them to bartering, basically strangling the economy. Second, it will trigger an immediate and destabilizing regional arms race, as Saudi Arabia and others seek their own weapons.
But the most important element of his argument, it relies on the domestic impact inside Iran.
Yes. Takeyh claims the bomb will confront the theocracy with explosive domestic political blowback. He argues that Iran is not like North Korea, which has survived despite massive pressure.
Why not?
Because Iran has a rich history of internal protests and revolutions. He predicts that when the public realizes the bomb has drained the treasury, caused international isolation, and provided no tangible strategic benefit, they will rise up against the regime.
Leading to a new secular government that would then willingly dismantle the arsenal to rejoin the global community.
That's his theory.
Okay, now Eric Brewer steps in with a vigorous rebuttal in "A nuclear Iran is not inevitable." Brewer argues that Takeyh's claims ignore crucial intelligence and they rest on assumptions about domestic politics that are highly questionable and politically dangerous.
The first point of contention is the issue of inevitability itself. Brewer argues that U.S. intelligence, going back to 2007, consistently indicates Iran is not resolved to produce weapons immediately.
Then what are they doing?
Instead, Iran is pursuing a hedging strategy. They want the ability to build the bomb if they decide they need it. They're maintaining a breakout capability, essentially, but they have not crossed the weaponization threshold.
So Iran's decision is purely a calculated choice based on a cost-benefit approach. It's not some foregone conclusion driven by revolutionary ideology.
Exactly. Brewer points out that Iran's willingness to adhere to the 2015 nuclear deal previously, which drastically rolled back its program under monitoring, is evidence that its decision to weaponize is not guaranteed. They're managing risk, not marching inexorably forward.
Brewer also highlights the physical barriers to a quick nuclear breakout. The idea that once they enrich enough material, a bomb just appears instantly is false.
It is. While Iran could quickly produce enough fissile material, the process of assembly and weaponization is the true bottleneck, and this fissile material production would occur at sites monitored by international inspectors.
So there's a high risk of detection and intervention.
A very high risk. Furthermore, the weaponization process, packaging the material, designing the warhead, loading it onto a missile, that takes a long time. Brewer cites intelligence suggesting there has been no progress in the weapons project for over a decade.
So even if they break out, they're not done.
Even from the moment Iran achieves breakout, there is potentially still up to 2 years before a deliverable weapon is ready. Iran would have to be, as he says, quite desperate to risk detection and intervention for a single, unproven device.
Brewer also sharply critiques Takeyh's prediction of a global backlash leading to regime change through sanctions.
He says this assumes a level of global cooperation that is just impossible.
No.
Brewer argues a global pressure campaign for sanctions that is explicitly aimed at regime change would fail. Most U.S. allies in Europe and Asia would reject sanctions if their true goal was destabilization.
And what about China and Russia?
Major global powers like China and Russia would actively defy it. They would continue buying Iranian oil, selling the military equipment, and ensuring Tehran has access to international currency markets outside the dollar system. You'd end up with a very leaky sanctions regime.
And if we compare this to previous proliferators, it seems like the international response always softens once the weapon is actually achieved.
Brewer makes that historical comparison crucial. International pressure tends to gradually lessen after a country crosses the nuclear threshold. Look at the response to India's and Pakistan's tests in 1998.
Right.
The international community, after some initial condemnation, had very little appetite for imposing high, lasting economic costs when the likelihood of New Delhi and Islamabad disarming was low. Pressure for a regime collapse would be even harder to sustain.
This is where Brewer finds Takeyh's policy recommendation, actively deploying U.S. nuclear weapons in the Gulf and encouraging regime overthrow to be the most dangerous. This goes right back to Sagan's organizational risks.
Brewer calls this specific policy flirting with disaster. The United States typically seeks to avoid political instability in nuclear states precisely because of the inherent organizational risk of theft, loss, or unintended use of nuclear weapons during a government collapse.
So encouraging the overthrow of a nuclear-armed regime is the most reckless policy possible in a Sagan-esque world.
Absolutely. Furthermore, placing U.S. nuclear weapons in the Gulf, as Takeyh suggests, could dramatically increase the risk of war by compelling Iran to adopt a dangerous, tightly coupled use them or lose them posture in a crisis.
And Brewer questions the fundamental assumption that the Iranian public would even revolt against the bomb. Many might see it as a source of national pride, even if they oppose the current leadership.
The bomb could actually unify the population against outside pressure. It's a very real possibility.
So what's Brewer's bottom line?
Brewer concludes by insisting that rather than resigning itself to inevitability, the United States must focus on prevention. He says the best way to prevent the bomb is reaching a robust deal that rolls back the program under close monitoring in exchange for verifiable sanctions relief.
But keep the military option on the table.
He argues the military option should be kept in the back pocket, but diplomacy must remain the priority because it is the only path that addresses the political demand for the weapon without escalating all those organizational risks.
So if we look back at the entire arc of this deep dive, from Waltz's theoretical stability to Sagan's organizational pessimism and then its application to South Asia and Iran, what are the key synthesized takeaways for international security in this era of globalization?
Well, the core learning objective is recognizing this fundamental paradox. Nuclear weapons impose a kind of stability through deterrence, but they also introduce immense risks through organizational and human fallibility. Waltz shows us the theoretical ideal, where rational states are deterred by the promise of catastrophe. But then Sagan comes in and reminds us that the organizations managing these weapons are prone to bias, error, and vulnerability.
Especially in new, tightly coupled nuclear states.
Exactly. And we saw those destabilizing realities play out so clearly in the case studies, particularly in South Asia. The geographical proximity, the organizational preferences, the generals acting on their inherent bias toward offense pushed India and Pakistan repeatedly toward crisis.
The risk of preventive war especially just violates the elegant simplicity of Waltz's theory.
It does. And the debate over Iran, featuring Takeyh and Brewer, it directly uses these foundations. Takeyh, ironically, echoes Waltz's idea that nuclear weapons grant no real strategic advantage.
But he uses that to argue for a policy of aggressive destabilization.
Sanctions and foreign nuclear deployment, which Brewer correctly notes dramatically increases all those Sagan-esque organizational risks of theft, loss, or unintended use. It's a dangerous policy that fails to account for how nuclear weapons management actually works in reality.
And this connects so deeply to our study of globalization because proliferation challenges the entire structure of international cooperation. It tests the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it complicates global commerce through sanctions, and it constantly tests the security commitments of major powers to their allies.
And the consequences of a regional nuclear exchange. I mean, just think of the environmental and economic fallout. It would be felt globally. It demonstrates that international security is fundamentally interdependent.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought based on the source material.
Yes. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to limit the spread of weapons, actually encourages the development of nuclear power reactors in non-nuclear weapon states in exchange for safeguards.
Odd.
But as of 2017, nuclear power reactors were operational in 32 countries. And Scott Sagan estimates that up to 30 countries have the necessary industrial infrastructure and scientific expertise to build nuclear weapons on a crash basis if they chose to do so.
So, the very treaty meant to stop proliferation has actually helped spread the technological capability to achieve it. It's created what the sources call a latent nuclear weapons capability in dozens of countries.
Precisely. So the final question for you to think about is this. If diplomacy fails in Iran or elsewhere, should the international focus shift entirely, as some of these scholars suggest, to addressing the political demand for nuclear weapons?
Meaning the perceived security threats that motivate states to want them in the first place.
Rather than just restricting the supply of nuclear material, what does a world look like where the bomb option is widely available, technically, but remains unused because the political motivation to cross that threshold is gone? That is the ultimate long-term security challenge that globalization faces today. Managing the political environment, not just the technology.